Hey yo everyone, thanks for tuning in again. If you decided to give the game a shot after my last videos, welcome back. If you're an experienced player, please consider this to be a basic overview of just what the stats are, and not a be-all end-all guide on how to min-max. Today, we're just focusing on explaining the stats in Aura Kingdom. And let's start from the basics. Welcome to the number zone. The 6 basic stats are mostly self-explanatory, but let's go over how they're implemented in-game. Starting with attack. This is your base damage. More is good. A little trivia, on screen you'll see that the visible damage effects in combat, if turned on, show a cap of 99,999,999, but this is only visual. You can see your true damage beyond 100 million by adding a chat window with a damage log. Crit. This is your chance to do a critical hit. When hitting enemies, critical hits show up in bigger effect boxes while regular hits are just numbers. The percent listed beside it is your chance to do a critical hit to a target of equal level to you, and it caps at 100%. Past Awakening, having more than 100%, grants you extra crit damage cap. Speed. This affects your basic attack speed, skill cooldowns, and dot ticks. It caps at 50%. Past Awakening, having more than 50%, grants you a zeal chance, with more speed increasing the chance, not the damage dealt by the zeal. It's listed as Rapid Assault in your damage monitor. HP. This is your life. If it runs out, you die. There is no penalty for dying in Aura Kingdom, so feel free to challenge things you aren't sure you can beat without fear of repercussions. Defense. This is your damage mitigation. It caps at 80% on classes other than Guardian, which can go up to 90% with Weapon Mastery, and we're not going to get into Weapon Mastery too much today. Past Awakening, having more than cap is converted into bonus HP. And since I said I would add it in this video but I couldn't find a good spot for it, percent-based defense reduction versus enemies caps at 50%, but flat defense reduction does not have a cap. So if you're using skills or masteries to reduce the boss's defense by percent amount, depending on your kit, extra def reduction will be wasted. If it's a percent, but not if it's flat. Evasion. This is your chance to avoid being hit. The percent is your chance to avoid attacks from equal level enemies. It caps at 95%, but Duelist can go up to 97% with Weapon Mastery. Note that evasion has no effect on red carpet attacks, you have to dodge those manually. Past Awakening, overcap evasion will grant total dodge chance, which is a second chance to evade skills you didn't evade. It still doesn't work on red carpets though. When it kicks in, you can see an extra note in the battle monitor chat. Next up, the bottom of your stats window. Starting with crit damage. This is how much general crit damage you have, but it doesn't count everything. Bear with me here, we're getting there, but right now the important thing is mousing over to check your crit damage cap. Note that this will not show how much general crit damage you have if it's more than your cap. If the cap shown is the same as the amount here, you are probably massively wasting extra crit damage and need to work on getting your cap higher. Just remember to check while in combat if you have gear that boosts it while fighting. But we're going further into this, it's really important. Most classes in Aura Kingdom have, at base, a crit damage cap of 300%, but various skills, buffs, and gear set effects can increase this. Your default crit damage, with no gear, is 130%, meaning that each critical strike will do 30% more damage than your regular attacks. Your current crit damage versus bosses, which is when it matters the most, is calculated in your detail window by adding your main class crit damage and your versus boss crit damage. If it's over your current cap, you don't get any more benefits from crit damage. Note that your main class crit damage is like the main window and starts at 130%, while the boss crit damage starts at 0%. So, using my bow here as an example, I have 339 main weapon crit damage and 200% boss crit damage, which gives me a total of 539. My crit cap shows 343, but I have a couple different sources of crit damage cap in my gear and kit as a ranger, which puts my max potential much higher, and as you can see, I get up to 594 in this video, meaning I could build a little more if I liked. So let's talk about those gear options. The level 95 Wild Howl set of accessories is recommended for Awakening because it increases crit damage and cap, though on your first Awakening you'll probably just be worried about the crit damage part and not the cap yet. The S5 accessory set, known lovingly as Agony but technically called Demonic Release, increases your crit damage cap by 150% and is favored by basically all players over S5. You need a lot of crit damage to make use of it, so you don't need to rush to get it right away on your first character, but this is a highly recommended set for its ability to supercharge your crit damage ceiling. Many endgame players still use this. That was a lot, but crit damage is a really key stat to getting your damage up, so I thought it was really important to dig in here. But let's move on, because the rest that are on the main window are pretty quick. Accuracy. This is your probability to hit targets of the same level. The default cap is 75%, but the accuracy added in your weapon mastery allows any class to build up to 90%. Heal. This is your general healing bonus, and increases how much your skills heal. It does affect things like heal ticks from skills, think like Bard's Ballad, but it does not affect nocturnal HP recovery, that is, lifesteal. I'll take this opportunity to say that when anyone says nocturnal or noct, they mean lifesteal in Aura Kingdom. There's a couple other healing stats, P healing, healing potency, received healing, but not gonna lie, I tested out potency and received and they didn't affect ticks or noct heals. And it's not on any endgame gear, so I suspect these stats have basically been abandoned. And finally, we have move speed. This is your ability to move, to go fast. Okay, that took a while, but that's still just the basics. It's time to get into the detailed list. First off, when you first open your detailed list, the Equipped tab just shows you your current gear and allows you to view them by mousing over, plus your current mastery and your secret stones. So let's just move on to the Offensive tab where it really gets started. The first section is your main weapon stats. We talked about this a bit in the crit damage section too, but I'll add that if you take main weapon crit nodes on your Envoy path, this is where you see the effective crit rate for your main weapon skills. Just keep in mind that this doesn't count for overtap after awakening. As a result, you probably want to try to overtap your crit rate without the Envoy nodes. It's not always an option. For example, I can't do it on Dark Bow in order to get my Dimensional Shot nodes, but it's something to keep in mind. Next up is the section for versus bosses, versus elites, and versus enemy players. And this is where we get to that word you've probably heard everyone use when talking about stats. Detail damage. It's a multiplier on top of your base damage, and generally when you want to know what your detail damage is, you want to look at your boss damage category. General detail damage goes into all three, boss, elites, and players, but your main focus in PvE is just going to be your boss damage. For reference, elites are the mobs that have a nameplate with 2 stars. Usually you'll see some mixed in with regular mobs as you go through the dungeons. Detail damage directly negates the damage dealt debuff that dungeons have. Check out the dungeon's effects list in the database. You can see the damage dealt category for every dungeon listed in the first column. For example, Infernal Citadel Hell Mode, which was added in the January patch and is an S25 dungeon, has negative 190%, meaning that on bosses, my 200% detail damage is reduced to a measly 10% bonus. So, you can see why this is such an important stat. It caps at 300%, but keep in mind that when everything has such large debuffs, you effectively won't be hitting that cap. Here's a little story about something that happened in the past. When the S10 Hell Mode dungeons were originally released, they accidentally had 2 copies of the damage taken reduction percent for all mobs and bosses in them. So, some players were in a funny position where their general detail damage was far, far below the negating threshold for mobs, but their boss sources were above it. So they actually couldn't damage mobs, but they could still kill the bosses. If you find yourself struggling more on mobs than on bosses, it probably means you're low on general detail damage. Assuming you're around S10, try using 50% detail food and drink. That is, like Oriental Beauty Steamed Milk, which is an S1 food, and Fantasy Noble Herbal Tea, which is an S10 food, just as an example. If that allows you to damage mobs normally, it means you need to build your regular detail damage more. This isn't going to happen in early game, and again, the specific situation that I'm referencing was the result of a mistake, but it is just a funny result of the stat system. If you want to calculate your general detail damage, check your archive for any bonuses versus players, and then subtract that from your versus players detail damage while not wearing any PvP gear to see how much you have. And since I brought up food, detail damage food is a great option after awakening if you're lacking detailed stats, but if you're already knocking enemies down, you can instead use triple strike food. Other popular foods are the move speed and experience ones, but reserve those for when you don't need the bonuses to fight through. I'll have to cover professions in the future too. It's added to the list of topics to cover now. Okay, so the next category in your offensive list is elemental damage. Every skill player and enemy in Ori Kingdom has one of 7 elements, the 6 actual elements, and violence, by which I mean physical. First listed is your damage buffs versus elements. You can see the element of an enemy by the symbol on their nameplate or the icon next to their health bar. Note that you have an element too, decided by your armor's element. Damage versus elements increases your output versus those targets that match. Generally, it's recommended to build up a good amount of dark damage in your weapon mastery or from archive because a lot of bosses are dark around 95 to S5. Sadly, the Awakening realms are physical, and you'll note there's no listing for damage versus physical targets. And that's because there's no sources of damage versus physical targets. And based on looking at the Eidolon purification scrolls in the Taiwan server, which is ahead of us, damage versus physical has not been added there. They only list the 6 elements as options for the damage versus target element effect that you can get on Eidolon stars. Next up is skill elemental damage. As I said, each skill has an element icon on it, and that determines which of the next section's buffs apply to it. Usually you want to build your character around the element of their strongest skill, or the one you like to use the most. For example, my favorite class, Ranger, can be played wholly around Arrow of Light, or dark around Dimensional Shot. You want to craft or get a weapon with the same element as that skill, as it adds a secret, unlisted boost to skills of that element. Note that violent-type weapons do not buff physical skills. On the not-secret side, you can build up damage for your element with Eidolon stars, mount buffs, trophies, and Eidolon archive, and this list isn't really exhaustive, but it's a great way to start. As for how much you want, as much as you can get. Theoretically, it should cap at 300% too, but you're not going to get to 300% anytime soon. Note that you can shuffle physical skill damage onto Eidolon stars, but even looking at all of the Eidolons released in the next year in Taiwan, none natively have physical stars. Physical was actually only added as a proper element in 2023 on the global servers, so there are way fewer sources for it in general. Especially if you're new to the game, it is strongly recommended to try to play an element other than physical to start, as they will have way easier sources of buffs. Pro tip for PvP, as I mentioned, the element on your armor determines your personal element. So, ideally you want to get physical element armor for PvP. Other players' damage versus element will work on you if your armor has an element. In PvE, dark element is often recommended because you actually take a little less damage from skills of that element. Just keep in mind that this is specifically the skill element, not the boss's element. Dark bosses do also use other elements in their skills. This goes both ways. Your dark skills will do slightly less damage to dark targets. But if you build completely around the boss's element, the reduction isn't enough to warrant a completely different rotation to avoid the skill. And I'm gonna take a moment here to talk about 2 good gear sources for elemental skill damage. To start, the level 95 cultural relics from the archaeology dungeon, or more likely from the encyclopedia, are a great accessory for you to choose. Equip the one that matches your favorite skill and fortify it up. Many players stick with elemental trophies far into late game. For your first awakening, for your other trophy, you can choose a little more based on your needs. For example, Dabaka's makeshift contraption can be a nice debuffer, and Gazigla's crafted trophy has boss damage. But for survivability on your very first awakening, you might like Warren Dix's Stubborn Soul. Not gonna lie, I probably should have used Warren Dix as it would have given me more buffers on healing since I kept forgetting I wasn't leeching enough life. And next, we're gonna talk about your Gaia emblem. This goes at the slot at the bottom left below your ring. You can buy Gaia emblems in Navia from the Eidolon Researcher near the Class Masters, but not only do these have a level requirement, they have an Eidolon point requirement as well, so you won't be able to equip anything too impressive on your first character. Instead, you should build up your monthly Dragon Point accumulation, and on your first character, those items that you get while running quests will give you DP count, and try to get your hands on those Dragon Coins. Then run the Dragon Paragon table to get one of the emblems off the first row that matches your element of choice. These only need 50,000 Eidolon points, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. I hit this on my fresh account no problem. For example, a level 60 1-star Eidolon is worth 25,000 points, so just 2 Eidolons raised to 60 is enough to equip these emblems. Anyway, once you take that emblem out of your prize pool, it will gain 2 more stats. There are a lot more Gaia emblems out there, including some that are only in the cash shop or on Paragon, but for your first awakening, these guys will serve you well. If you can't get your hands on the dragon coins from the dragon point accumulation, try asking around your guild or friends. I bet some of them will have more dragon paracoins than they know what to do with from running bonds and can hook you up with a nice, cheap emblem. Right, that was a digression, so moving on, a common question is whether to go for more detailed or one of the elemental damages. And to answer that, are you familiar with diminishing returns? This is oversimplified, but the more of a stat you have, the less effective each percent increase has on the output proportionally. Once your detailed damage is high enough that you're negating the shield, as a rule of thumb, you will usually get more benefit from increasing whichever stat is lower. And, of course, in later game you'll end up facing elemental damage reduction in dungeons as well. When your stat is red, that means it's negative. I don't really want to crunch numbers here. As I said, this isn't intended to be a min-maxer's guide on the exact amount of stats you need, but a guide to get you started on understanding what things do. But, as an extreme example, if you have 200% detail damage and 20% skill Ela damage, your skill will benefit more from 10% more skill Ela damage than you will from 10% more detail damage. This is a universal math thing, so if you want to understand more, I would recommend searching for videos specifically focusing just on diminishing returns in any game. I don't feel I have what it takes to really get into it with charts and hard numbers here, nor is that what this video is for. So, let's move on to the next stat. Pen and reinforcement. Starting with Twilight Forest Hell mode, and all modes of all dungeons from Chronowood Cavern onwards, you'll start to see these little gold shields on mobs and bosses in dungeons. This means they have reinforcement. Pen and reinforcement have the same relationship as detail damage and damage dealt reduction. Your pen negates the reinforcement shield. The difference is that once your pen is more than the shield, it doesn't increase your damage at all. Overstacking pen does nothing. Sadly, this puts it in a strange place where when you don't have enough, nothing else matters at all, but once you have enough, more doesn't help. On your first awakening, you're going to need to stack some up, and you won't need to worry about overstacking, as the only way to do that at level 99 would be to have a bunch of archives, which you won't have on your first awakening. So, here's your sources for your first awakening. High-level weapons have pen built-in. High-level armor and weapons, that is, level 80 and up, can slot enchantment cards with pen, and each class will have some way to build up pen while fighting, specific to their class. Unfortunately, some are easier to make use of than others. The awakening bosses have 60% reinforcement, so you will only do 40% of your damage if you have 0 pen. Next up, let's talk about blood armor. Once you get into later game, you'll start running into blood armor shields. These are a second bar on a boss that, as long as it's up, you basically do no damage to the boss. The first place you'll see it is in the Nightmare Realm, a level S1 dungeon. From there, it only appears in the S10 Nightmare Realm and Hell modes of dungeons from S15 upwards. In order to break these shields, you need armor piercing. This stat can be rolled on costumes, holy spirits, and high-level gear can have it as a fortification reward. This stat is the number of points you can reduce on blood armor per second if you attack constantly. I've done an old test video of this so you can see it in action. In a nutshell, if your enemy has 600 blood armor and you have 30 armor piercing, it will take 20 seconds of constant attacks to remove the shield, no matter how much damage each attack does. Some bosses can regen their shield, specifically the Nightmare Realm bosses and world bosses, but others don't, like dungeon bosses, unless you exit combat. Ideally, you want to work on building up debuffs or building up whatever buffs your class can in combat, without being concerned about damage while you're breaking the shield, and then get ready to unleash the offensive onslaught the moment the shield is down. But eventually you'll get to a point like me where you've got enough armor piercing to just nuke the shields without thinking too much about it. So, about Nightmare Realm. It's a place where you can get formulas for Holy Spirit upgrades. Holy Spirits are only for S level 1+, so you won't be able to use them for Awakening, but you can start farming for them at level 90 by joining the Divine Trial PvP mode. It's a battle royale where you're supposed to turn into Eidolons to fight against other players anonymously to win. You don't need PvP gear, and you should be able to get at least a few crystals to exchange for spirits every time you join. The cases you can exchange the crystals for are selection styles, so you don't need to worry about RNG for which Holy Spirit you get. The chest contents are also tradable, so if you're above level 90 and online around the time of Divine Trial, it's worth joining in. I don't want to make claims on what exactly you can sell Holy Spirits for, as the market will always vary. But certainly you can make some G if you can grind them out. The Netherworld Jade is a good choice to sell. And I couldn't find a good spot for it, but another thing you can get in Nightmare Realm is the basic Anima reshuffling items. Anima go in the last gear slot that we haven't talked about next to your weapon. Usually they add a few effects, but they don't have flat stats like other gear, and they don't have fortification. Floors 51 to 55 in Sky Tower can drop the lower tier orange ones, and whenever a patch has dropped, we've gotten gold ones in the present packs from X-Legend, but generally the best ones are going to be from Paragon or the shop. For your first awakening, basically if you have one, it can't hurt to use it. They're equipable from level 25 upwards, but there's no way for you to actually farm them. Some of the orange tier can be pretty cheap in the auction house. They're just probably not going to help a ton if they're that cheap. Your gold is probably better spent elsewhere when you're getting ready for awakening. Okay, so that's it for today, I think. That was really information dense, especially since I ended up mixing in the gear I couldn't fit in the last episode. I hope this helps you get started on your path to greatness. Next time we're going to look into the scary stuff, sources of bonus stats. I think this will probably take 2 weeks again, so don't be disappointed if you don't see it next week. And I think I'm going to have to touch on professions in that video too. Ugh, gonna be in here for over 20 minutes again, aren't I? Anyway, thank you for watching, and I just want to say this again. Remember, the most important thing is to have fun. If you're worried that you're doing it wrong, just remember, it's a game, so if you're having fun, you're doing it right. Catch you next time.